I'm Jessel Noor for the Real News Network in Baltimore. Party frontrunners Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump won big on Tuesday, adding to their superdelegate leads for both the Republican and Democratic primaries. Clinton, in fact, swept all 5 states after being declared winner in a close race in Ohio, and Trump knocked Marco Rubio out of the race after taking his home state of Florida. Well, now joining us to discuss all of this is Bill Curry. He's a columnist for Salon.com, and he was White House counselor to President Clinton. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So, Bill, let's start with the Republican side. We all saw, the world saw all the violence that erupted at the Trump rallies across the country, really, over this weekend, starting on Friday in St. Louis and Chicago. Yet that doesn't seem to have been an issue with the voters on the Republican side. Trump coasted a victory, except for Ohio, where Governor John Kasich won his home state.
Yeah, as I said earlier, that today that the first look certainly is it didn't cost him much. That Republicans looked at this really kind of neo-fascist kind of behavior, inciting people to violence, all this condemning of the other, all this divisiveness, and for the Trump part of the party, which is substantial. Those guys said, that's fine. The Republicans have a bigger problem, and that Trump could well end up with 40% of the vote in all of these primaries and over 50% of the delegates. And there is, in Florida, half the Republicans who walked out of those polls told exit pollsters that they might not vote for the Republican nominee. And most of those were anti-Trump people expressing their opinions. That's half of the primary base walking out of the polls and saying that if they didn't get their way, they might not go. They might not stick with the party. And so, one of the things about Trump, we watch his antics. We look at this man with a palpable narcissistic character disorder, a pathological liar, and with many of the symptoms of fascism unabashedly on display, and we think, God, the whole country's going to hell in a handbasket. But not even all the Republicans are sold on him. And this, you're watching this thing about the conventions now. What will the convention be like? I think Trump may get to his 51%, and if so, he'll probably be their nominee. But they ought to stop afterward and ask themselves, they rigged this with winner-take-all primaries, thinking that it would help their party insider elite candidate. Instead, it's bringing about the possible even realignment of their party, certainly their own defeat, the defeat of the insiders. And they ought to ask themselves, who knows that they will muster up the moral conviction to do so, but they ought to ask themselves what all this anti-democratic process that they have in place has really done for them. We talk about brokered conventions or contested conventions or open conventions. The bottom line is they're about to have a convention in which 51% of their delegates are required by party rule to vote for a man who only got 40% of the votes in the primary. The Democrats have an equal problem on their side with their superdelegates, but it's sort of, it's really kind of, I think, one of the lessons of all this. Trump comes out. It might have ended last night in Ohio if he'd beaten Kasich. He doesn't seem to have lost much by inciting crowds to violence within his own base. It's enough to get him 40% of the vote, and 40% of the vote may get him 51% of the delegates.
And Bill, I wanted to ask you, one of the reasons his message is resonating so widely in the Republican Party is he is talking about jobs, he is talking about free trade, so-called free trade policies, and he's talking about putting Americans back to work in a way that is compelling and appealing to the Republican Party base, kind of in the same way that Sanders is talking about those issues. And of course, they're very different, polar opposites on many other issues. But talk about what this means for the future of the Republican Party, and if it's going to be possible, even the point's been made. Can Hillary Clinton beat Trump in the general election with this vicious war that Clinton and Sanders have now, the Democratic Party, the primary has now sort of devolved into? Can Clinton win over those voters that are dissatisfied on economic policies and being drawn to Trump?
Well, there are a lot of points in there, and I agree with most of the premises. one of the things I want to say, I've never used the word fascist to describe a figure in mainstream political life, or really any American political figure that I can think of offhand, contemporary. And it's hard. I've never talked about opponents in psychological terms. When I talked about narcissism and pathological lying, one of the problems the media is having in covering Trump is that it has a certain delicacy about fascism and about emotional deformities, and it is understandable and for the most part serves us well. Not here. This is a very, very disturbed guy with horrible politics, and there comes a point where you have to begin to name it. The country actually has a right to have us do this. One of the things he reminds us about fascism is that it's ideologically nondescript. You can be for a number of left things and a number of right things, so long as you're xenophobic, racist, and authoritarian. And so Trump is making a pitch to distressed white working class voters who don't feel, understandably, that they hear their name called very often by the Democratic Party, whose economic contract, who found themselves, they went from manufacturing blue collar jobs to service sector blue collar jobs, thus exiting the middle class by the wrong door, and no one's paid much attention to them since. And I really believe that it's pay-to-play politics that creates fascist politics, that creates a permanent underclass within an ethnic majority. And you can see it in Europe, you can see it here, and it happens all the time. And so there really is this battle, in a sense, for the soul of a lot of dispossessed people right now, of the newly dispossessed. And the Democratic Party, I believe one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton is actually the weaker candidate is that, if I'm right, and it's pay-to-play politics that created fascist politics, then offering pay-to-play politics as the alternative to fascist politics may not be the best idea. It may not be the best way to go. Having said that, what do I believe? I believe that that Trump is the one candidate that I feel Clinton can beat. And she's the only candidate he has any prayer of beating. Trump couldn't beat any Democrat in public office except Hillary, and even that'll be a climb for him. Bernie beats Trump in one recent poll by as much as FDR beat Alf Landon. It would be a landslide. It would bring us at least the Senate and a new court and probably a House and maybe even some of these gerrymandering legislatures. What we're giving up here, because we think we know better, because everybody's doing all this outdated tactical thinking among the Democratic elites, we're giving up the chance for an historic landslide and a realignment that is really what the base of our party wants. So yes, I do think that Bernie and Trump, in different ways, whether it's trade, public corruption, even sometimes universal health care, land wars in the Mideast, there's a long line of issues, the economic populist issues that brought white and black and Hispanic voters together in this country in the old Democratic coalition, that we have re-gifted to the Republicans. We've let even someone like Trump walk away from them. And it's the reason we're going to have to fight hard to reassemble that coalition. Bernie wouldn't have to fight so hard because he really believes that stuff, because he spent his whole life on it and everybody knows it. Hillary would have to fight very hard and fight smarter than she's fought so far.
So, Bill, just moments before this interview, it was announced that President Obama is going to nominate Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. We're not going to talk too much about his record because this announcement just came out, and the Republicans have already promised to block any of President Obama's Supreme Court nominees. But the question I want to pose to you is, how would a Supreme Court nominee of a Hillary Clinton presidency be different than a nominee of a Bernie Sanders presidency, and what could that mean for the nation and the future of this country?
Well, again, these are tough calls, and I understand that it's a tough call. If you think you can get someone in now who isn't your ideal candidate, knowing that you might lose in November and face the prospect of a 5-4 Republican court for the rest of the natural lives of anybody middle-aged or older in America right now, that is a disaster. At the same time, Garland, who is most famous for having written the Guantanamo decision that even a Republican Supreme Court overruled, saying that there were no habeas corpus rights to people who were to the Guantanamo prisoners, and who is known as a centrist, is a former prosecutor. When I worked for Bill Clinton, 53% of our federal district judges were ex-prosecutors. That's how centrist Clinton went. A majority had been prosecutors. The Republicans paint them all as communist ideologues. Majority prosecutors. And Obama, while this is a compromise candidate in the eyes of many Democrats, Obama's real ideology, if you're just looking at the facts and really listening to what he says, this is someone who, other than his being 63 years old, and so they're looking for younger people so they'll last longer under this lifelong tenure court rule we have. This is actually someone Obama could even be Obama's first choice. And the difference is, as has been mentioned in some of these articles, this is a guy who's been a prosecutor and very tough on violent criminals and on sort of the blue collar people who really who fall afoul of all those laws. The problem is that an awful lot of those guys are not also tough on white collar criminals who actually steal way more money. And with the exception of Sonia Sotomayor, and it's a little bit, Obama's last the two appointees haven't been bad on this, but Sonia Sotomayor in particular has been pretty good. But the history of Democratic Supreme Court appointments has been that they're good on criminal justice issues and they're good on cultural issues, and they're not that much better on corporate power issues than the Republicans. And that there's really been a kind of elite consensus on the Supreme Court, just as there is an elite consensus at the top of the two parties, who really do agree on, the Republicans and Democrats at the top, for all the talk about polarization, for all the polarization on cultural issues, they agree on fiscal austerity, global trade, financial deregulation, et cetera, a long, long line of issues. And in the court, there's been much more agreement than you might expect on a lot of corporate issues. And so to go to your question, the difference between what an Obama would do, what he just did, from what we can see, and I want to look more about, everything I say now, I'd like to say is somewhat provisional. I know a little bit about this judge, but I haven't done the reading. We just heard this news. But from what we can see, this looks like about what you'd expected. And what we aren't getting is a court that understands some of the issues, like whether the class action suits, some of the questions about that were involved in the criminal justice bill in the Congress, about whether about how and to what extent you have to find criminal intent in the big Wall Street guys who put together these massive $100 billion scams. How hard are we going to make it to prosecute corporate crime? How strongly are we going to protect whether it's tort law or corporate freedom of information, government freedom of information, all those issues that are about the little guy's ability to hold the powerful accountable, to really have a day in court that means something. Those issues are the issues that not even our Democratic appointees, I think, have been strong enough on. And a Sanders presidency would produce Supreme Court nominees who looked at those issues, not in some radical way, by the way, but the way we did look at them until we fell into the extremism of the present moment. A lot of it is just reaching back into a better past and resurrecting, when I think, some of the things that Ralph Nader accomplished in corporate accountability and that the courts have been at war with, bringing back some of the progress we made in the 60s and 70s. I want to see a court protect some of the progress that hasn't been undone and restore some that has. And I don't, this isn't a guy. This is a guy who will defend Roe v. Wade. And that's not a small thing, far from it. But there's a whole set of other issues here that have been swept under the rug by a Democratic Party that's too anxious to be unified, that needs to air these things. And the court appointment this morning and the court appointments we've had for a long time from within our party reflect that.
So Bill Curry, I hope you stay with us. We're going to continue this conversation and talk more about what's in the future for Bernie Sanders' campaign.